honestly, everyone's intuitive. It's kind of like playing piano. Everybody's not going to be Chopin. Most of us won't. I'm a regular person who just happens to love this and do this. And this is part of my lived experience and it's a passion, but I don't do professional psychic readings. And people don't have to go into this with that aim. It's really about just having it be another sense that they pay attention to and use to enhance their daily lives.
Hey, thanks for joining us for the Hemi-Sync podcast. Our guest today is Dr. Traci Stein. Traci first appeared on the show last year. That was episode 33. And this one builds on the previous episode, so you may want to watch that one first if you haven't already. But Dr. Stein holds a PhD and MPH, is a health psychologist, award-winning author, and the creator of a series of popular guided imagery, self-hypnosis, and meditation audio programs. For over 2 decades, Dr. Stein has explored the interrelationship among mind, body, and spirit in health and well-being. Prior to receiving her PhD from Teachers College, Columbia University, Dr. Stein earned a master's degree in public health from New York University. She is also the former Director of Integrative Medicine at Columbia University Medical Center and has had a long-standing interest in complementary and alternative therapies. She has been featured or quoted in O, the Oprah magazine, Health, Shape.com, Women's Health, and more, and has been interviewed on numerous radio programs and podcasts. Her own podcast is called Unpacking Possibility with Dr. Traci Stein. In her new Hemi-Sync album, entitled Cultivating Intuition, Developing Clairvoyance, she guides you through some exercises to further develop and fine-tune your natural psychic or intuitive gifts. The offering consists of 4 tracks, which is an introduction, reconnecting to clairvoyance, enhancing clairvoyance, and psychic dreaming. Here is Dr. Traci Stein. So Traci, welcome back to the Hemi-Sync podcast. Thanks for joining us once again. We did a show with you not too long ago. So just to kind of do some quick review with the audience, there are the psychic senses, which we covered last time. Those were clairaudience, clairsentience, clairgustance, clairscent or clairolfaction, which I may not be pronouncing right. Please.
Perfect.
All right. Claircognizance and clairvoyance. And
Yay.
This album, this album deals with the latter. That's what we're here to discuss today. So for people that do not have much experience with clairvoyance, which I'd imagine is the majority, where do people generally experience clairvoyance? What's it like?
So clairvoyance really is clear seeing. That's what the word means. And that's actually what the experience is like. It really varies somewhat situation to situation and person to person. Usually clairvoyant experiences will be on the screen of your mind. So that kind of inner vision where you daydream, that's where you'll notice clairvoyant imagery. Once in a while, something will be so strong that you will see it as if it is outside of you in your environment. And, we can talk about examples of that as we go on. But most of the time, it's going to be on the screen of your mind.
Cool. And so do people generally experience it with their eyes wide open, with their eyes closed?
It's another good question. So I think in the beginning, people might, as they practice, notice more easily these images when their eyes are closed, because it kind of cuts out the normal day-to-day distractions, including and especially visual distractions like what's in your space. But a lot of the kind of random clairvoyant experiences will happen while your eyes open doing something else, maybe when your mind's a little bit quiet. So you can be having a conversation with someone and have a flash of something across the screen of your mind. The more you practice, the more easily you'll be able to recognize the difference between clairvoyant information and just kind of your thoughts and feelings and imagination.
Yeah, interesting. So a flash kind of seems like it would probably be like a still image, right? And then how common is it to have, say, moving images?
I think both happen. I think the still images are probably more frequent. And I'll give you an example. So if you're going to look for a car, right? Maybe you're looking at used cars and you're going to a few different places and you see one that looks really shiny and great and you're thinking, oh, I'm going to buy this one. The price is right. And then you see a flash of a lemon in your mind, or
Yeah.
or a junkyard or something like that, you might say, oh, wait a minute. That would be a still image that you would only need like a fraction of a second to know what
Hmm.
that means.
Interesting.
And that's pretty common.
Yeah.
Um,
So,
Sometimes it's movie-like though.
mhm. So in that instance, it was still, it was symbolic. Um, your eyes were probably open or closed. So that's a very interesting application for clairvoyance. And I can think of probably a bunch of others. Are there any that maybe folks, wouldn't generally consider?
I think that it's not unusual at all for us to have these related to work.
Mm,
So as an example, I'm going to give you an example of a protracted image that is not typical, but if something is really significant, you might have. So I had a client years ago, like many of my clients, this person had a lot of medical issues and a lot of significant emotional challenges. And at the time, I was seeing this person a few times a week. Sometimes I do that. Over the course of this week, where I maybe saw the person 3 times, it looked like there was a fog in front of their face. And by the third time I saw them, it was a much more dense fog to the point it was hard to focus on them. And, we're not sitting so far away. And I thought, oh, I really need to get new glasses. It was just like, what does this mean? But the thing is, I didn't notice it around anybody else. And what that told me was not, I always pay attention, but now I really need to pay attention. And so, I also noted to her other providers, the things that I noticed in the objective non-psychic world, because that's what they could hear.
mhm.
And it turned out this person had to be rushed to the emergency room later that week.
Wow.
So sometimes when people are physically like having some sort of situation where they're not well or their health is notably declining, that might be what I would see. And that
Mhm.
might be more prolonged. It's not exactly a movie. I've had movie experiences too.
Yeah.
But most of the time, I think we get quick flashes, and they might be paired with other psychic senses, like a clear knowing of what this means, or, your own voice saying, watch out for XYZ.
Yeah, that's interesting. And you actually make the point that as you develop one psychic sense, it tends to open the other ones up along
Yeah,
with it.
really does.
Mhm.
I think that's because if you think about your intuitive senses, your psychic senses, and your subconscious as like a friend, like somebody you're getting to know, the more you start talking to each other and finding that you're listening, the more the line of communication opens up, the more natural it becomes. And so now you've told yourself, I'm ready to receive intuitive information.
Yeah.
And now it's going to come through in more ways that you can understand.
Hmm. And so that's also an interesting point that you raised there with the subconscious, because that's a big part of unlocking this gift, right? This dormant ability, or for most folks, it's dormant.
Right. I mean, I think so. And for people who aren't familiar with that term, as a psychologist, we think about, your conscious awareness, the things that you're very present to and aware of in your environment, the conscious thoughts you're having. The subconscious is kind of the part of you that's daydreaming. It's the movie in your mind that's kind of in the background. It's what comes to the forefront when you're sleeping. Um, and it seems to be like that's a receiver for intuitive information.
Mhm.
And one of the reasons why meditation and tools like that can be so helpful is that meditation, like mindfulness, can help us tune out distractions so that the language of intuition and the language of the unconscious becomes clearer and more discernible, even in the midst of everyday distractions.
Hmm. Interesting. So meditation clearly helps. And now you're a certified hypnotherapist. And so that's
Yes.
a huge tool in your bag. Um,
Yes.
yeah. So how does hypnosis help in developing this ability?
So it's one of my favorite things to use generally, and I'll tell
Hmm.
you why. We all have these thoughts, our own inner critic, the things where we reason away, things that don't make sense at the time. And hypnosis can help us communicate more clearly with the subconscious, get some of the mental noise out of the way, and also prime us to have an experience ahead of actually having it. So
Hmm.
what I mean by that is, in the first album, there's an exercise to step into your future very comfortably psychic self.
Hmm.
Well, the subconscious doesn't know the difference between what you imagine and experience in a mental way very deeply and the objective world. It's not as bound by linear time.
Hmm.
And so hypnotic tools like hypnotic suggestions and guided imagery can help us more rapidly get into the space of receptivity for really any change we want to make, but intuition as well.
Right. And so you're inviting the listener on these tracks to enter into what's called a trance state. It's kind of a loaded word. What does a trance state mean?
So a trance is, just so everyone knows, it's something we go in and out of all the time,
Mhm.
every day. Even if you think you don't, you do.
Yeah.
So when you're driving in the car or a passenger and your mind is back at some party you left 20 minutes ago, or thinking about the dinner you're going to have in an hour,
Mhm.
while another part of you is still in the car or driving the car, that's a trance state. So a trance state is a state of increased absorption, usually in your inner world, um, and attention to something specific, and decreased attention to everything else. So when you're reading a good book, when you were at the movies and immersed in the movie, you forget that you're in a pleather seat next to strangers. You're
Yeah.
really engaged in the movie. That's a trance state. Those are everyday trances. Now, trance, when it's deliberate or clinical or on these recordings, is where, there are hypnotic suggestions, wording designed to help get you into a very specific state of inner focus and attention.
Mhm.
So it's your brain is wired to do this.
Yeah. Yeah. And so lots of folks that are familiar with us and with Hemi-Sync might think of a trance state, in similar terms. Using Hemi-Sync, it tends to put you into a deeper trance state than in some of the ones that, you're describing, for instance, driving a car. So the felt sensation might feel like your mind is still awake, but your body's kind of asleep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And usually, almost always, you will come back to normal waking awareness if you need to. The part of you that's driving the car
Yeah.
will stop or slow down if a squirrel runs across the road. That's a good thing.
Yeah.
If
And
somebody's calling you and you have to get up, you will.
yeah. And we should probably also draw the distinction between, hypnosis, the trance state, and subliminal here as well. So in all these exercises, the listener is in total control. There's nothing
Absolutely.
subliminal. Yeah.
Yeah.
Really good. So
You
we've
hear
touched
all the
on,
suggestions.
yeah. And so we've touched on meditation, mindfulness as a useful tool here, hypnosis, and then the third thing that you like to emphasize is journaling, right?
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
So, journaling is kind of this interesting thing. It has multiple functions, I think. And it's okay if people just thinking about it in terms of one of them. But journaling is, first, it's a way to keep track of the psychic impressions that you start getting.
Mm.
Write down the date, the time, the imagery that you got, and anything else you noticed. And then, your intuition might reveal itself that, oh, this is what happened. It might be that day, it might be in 6 months, but you can
Mhm.
go back and refer to it. What that does is it rewards your brain for getting a correct hit.
Yeah.
And as it reinforces that, it'll help you better recognize what's really intuitive communication and
Mhm.
what's just mental noise. And
Mhm.
that helps you get better and better and more accurate at
Mhm.
using intuition.
Interesting.
Another thing journaling does is, honestly, it kind of induces a trance state, right?
Huh.
Because we go into the movie in our minds
Yeah.
as we're writing things down.
Yeah.
Um,
Interesting.
yeah,
So in terms of, the correct hit,
yeah.
as you're opening up to clairvoyance, I mean, you're probably going to get like a lot of flow, right? A lot of information. How do you distinguish between what is, accurate, let's say, and what is maybe noise? Is there a feeling or?
Yeah, in addition to the record keeping, going
Yeah.
back and saying, oh, I felt this like in my solar plexus or a
Mhm.
tingling, or it just seemed really clear, whatever you note and you write down at the time. To me, intuitive information just has a particular feeling and it's really hard to articulate.
Mm.
But that said, even if the information is distressing,
Yeah.
I think it usually comes through neutrally, and then we have the thought or feeling about it.
Mm.
So I'm going to give you an example. Like a month before September 11th, we were living in Hoboken, which is like right across the water from Lower Manhattan.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember standing on the waterfront and looking at the Twin Towers and just having this weird thought and feeling like, oh, what if they weren't there?
Wow.
And it was an unsettling feeling, and I just kind of pushed it away.
Yeah.
So, but the image was neutral. It didn't make any sense. And often intuitive hits won't.
Yeah.
By the way, with big events, you know, thousands and thousands of people will notice that they've had some sort of kind of intuitive flash before
Mm-hmm.
something big happens. I think it's just because it's loud.
Yeah.
But again, it's a usually neutral experience. The reaction comes after.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of processing it, I mean, I'd imagine it's pretty common to want to analyze it, right? And so, like, your left brain kind of goes to work on it. Any thoughts on that? Any
I
advice?
think, yeah, I think
Yeah.
our left brains absolutely always want to try and make sense of things.
Mm-hmm.
And they do that using available and acceptable frameworks. So I'm going to give you a very benign example of a time when intuitive information came through for me and it made no sense. And I was hesitant to give it, and it made sense to the person who was receiving it. So a million years ago now, I was taking intuitive development classes at the ARE, or the Association for Research and Enlightenment, the Edgar Cayce
Yeah.
organization in Manhattan, and might be like 25 or 30 years ago now. And as part of the classes, we would be asked to then like randomly read for or tune into a person who was there. And it might be somebody who wasn't necessarily there the week before. So it was a stranger.
Mm-hmm.
And this woman that I was paired with, the information that came up was, among other things that made sense to her, it was something that didn't make sense to me, and I didn't want to give it. And I thought, this has to be weird mental noise. So the woman across from me was probably like 22. She, looked like a surfer. The stereotype of a surfer. She's blonde and young and maybe a little tan and just dressed casually. And I kept getting this image, the still image that I kept setting aside, but it kept coming up, of the Temple of Dendur in the Metropolitan Museum of Art.
Oh.
So for people who don't know what that is, it's actually a gigantic stone structure that you can walk through from ancient Egypt. And I felt just really weird. I was like, oh man, I'm like a terrible psychic. And I looked at her and I said, listen, I don't know what this means. I don't know if you were in Egypt in a previous life or something, and she stopped me and she was like, no, I love Egypt. I'm fascinated with it. I've been there a whole bunch of times, and I have this great group of friends that I've met there. And it wasn't for me. It didn't have to make sense to me. It made sense to her, and it was super specific.
Interesting.
So sometimes you'll notice that stuff that doesn't make sense, but it comes through neutrally, and it will come back if you ignore it.
Yeah.
Like I imagine putting it in a shelf to the side, and it kept coming back, and I gave it to her, and it made sense.
Uh-huh.
So you might find that will help you to recognize intuitive information. It makes another appearance, even though you're not focused on it.
Right. Interesting. Interesting. So in that situation, it made sense after you shared it.
Right.
Like, can you think of situations where maybe it's just not right to share it?
Yes. And this is kind of personal, but I'm going to share it and, see what you think. But so a friend of ours passed away very recently from a long illness that could no longer be managed.
Yeah.
And about 6 weeks ago, my husband and other friends wanted to cheer him up and cheer him on. And, you've got this and all that. And I said, don't do that, because you're going to foreclose any opportunity for him to talk to you about anything that doesn't fit with that. And my husband, I think, thought I was being a little bit negative. And he talked about running the marathon with him next year. And I said, he's not going to be running the marathon next year. And I don't want people to think that I know everybody's life path.
Yeah.
But, just for other things that came up, I never saw him, becoming an old person.
Right.
Um, so those are things that maybe you wouldn't want to share
Yeah. That's
until
interesting.
it feels like you have to, and you'd want to be thoughtful about who you share that with.
Yeah. End of life care is really tricky. I actually just wrapped a podcast on that subject.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, and so like giving false hope is one of the things that you don't want to do. Um, it's kind of unfair to the person who's transitioning.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Definitely. I would also say something that comes up sometimes when people are having psychic experiences and they're really excited and they might be picking up on a lot, especially in the beginning, there can be kind of like a rush. There can be a desire to tell people everything that somebody picks up about them. And
Mhm.
again, sometimes we're not right. Sometimes our own lens filters things in a way that's not accurate.
Yeah.
Um, but also just sometimes people don't want to hear that. It's not in their worldview or
Mm.
they're not ready for that information. So I'd be thoughtful about telling people things that you pick up about them that may make them feel kind of exposed
Mm.
or just intruded upon, or it might be not in their framework for what's acceptable.
Yeah.
And I would respect that. Those would be things I'd be thoughtful about sharing.
Sure. So I guess I'm curious, and you kind of mentioned, a story early on where you were very evaluative in a negative way of your own ability. Like, how has that changed over the years? Do you find that it's something you still slip into, or
I feel like I am much better at just being like, okay, like noting it and not feeling like I have to make a judgment necessarily. But that said, um, I always question things. And I think sometimes people will have intuitive hits that there's not really any reason for them to have them except to remind them that it's real.
yeah, interesting.
Um, does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Like spirit or your unconscious or subconscious will say like, oh, don't get off the path.
Hmm. Yeah. No, that's those are the ones you really want to pay attention to. And sometimes you're compelled to pay attention. Like those are the ones where, yeah, might kind of feel like crisis, but yeah, those are the ones that you have to pay attention to. But so getting more into the specifics of this album. So there's 4 tracks. The first is an introduction, and the exercises 1 and 2 are intended to further develop your third eye. And then track 4 is a psychic dreaming exercise. Can you tell us more about that? What's psychic dreaming? Sounds cool.
So yeah, I think even people who think they have not had clairvoyant experiences probably have.
Mm-hmm.
And especially during the dream state. So when we're dreaming, we talked about mental noise a few minutes ago. When we're sleeping, that kind of stuff is put to the side. And our normal hypercritical or overly analytical filter is also kind of resting. Now, dreams, much like the subconscious in general, um, can often be very metaphorical. Sometimes they're quite literal, but often they're very metaphorical.
Mm-hmm.
But you know what they mean when the thing happens that you're like, holy cow, I had this dream about this.
Yeah.
What I love about hypnotic imagery during the sleep state is that as you're drifting off to sleep and your brain waves are moving to a progressively slower predominant state, you'll find that that floatiness, I think, it just opens you up to not only hypnotic suggestion to
Mm-hmm.
become more psychic and clairvoyant specifically, but to intuition in general. There seems to be less separation between our consciousness and everything around us, I think. So it's a nice time to further program your mind really for anything you want to do.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, people who do that and keep a journal will find very rapidly that they wind up getting more psychic dreams
Yeah.
and that they're more accurate and that they remember them more clearly,
Very interesting.
especially if you write it down as soon as you get up.
Totally. Yeah. And so, this is a question that I like to ask people that are skilled in this. Um, at what point, so like, let's say, when you first started journaling, dream journaling, you're picking up 1, 2, maybe 3 dreams. At what point would you say that you're probably getting the vast majority of it, 90%.
You mean where most of your dreams are intuitive?
Well, I mean, so like, I think when I was dream journaling really extensively, like I had nights where I would get up to like maybe 7 dreams.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's amazing.
Yeah. So, I mean, that was not the norm, but like at that point, I kind of felt like, all right, I've got to be getting almost all of it right now. But the flip side of it is like, I think I wound up waking up feeling not quite as rested. So there's kind of
Yeah,
like a balance you have to strike. Um, yeah.
agreed.
But anyway, I was just curious if you had thoughts on that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think I think a way to further enhance your likelihood of having intuitive dreams and
Yeah.
dream recall would be to set an intention before you
Mm.
go to sleep. But your intention that you set could also just be to get a good night's rest.
Yeah.
So you don't always have to be working, do you know
Mhm.
what I mean, all the time. Um, you can also, by the way, dream. This is just an aside, you can dream for other people. And I don't know if
Explain.
you've met Julia Mossbridge. I don't
I
know
know the
her
name.
personally, but
Yeah.
she's a well-known researcher in the area of psychic phenomena. And actually years ago, she was doing dreaming for some people. Um, and I just she wound up dreaming for me. But you can do this with friends. You can decide that you're going to dream for a specific person.
Huh.
You can ask them to write down a question. You don't need to know the question, and you can give yourself the suggestion to dream something that is helpful for that person in answering their question. It is uncanny, the stuff that people wind up dreaming about. So
Oh,
when
that's
you
interesting.
decide to do it,
Yeah.
it can be incredibly powerful and specific.
Uh-huh.
Whether symbolic or literal depends.
Interesting.
But I also think it's important to get a good night's sleep. So
Yeah. I'd not heard of that practice. That's very interesting.
it's a fun exercise, and you could do it with a group. You don't even need to know the name of the person that you're
Yeah.
dreaming for. You could get a piece of paper with their name and find out after.
Mm-hmm.
What I love about psychic work that it really, time really is not linear. And the same barriers that apply in normal daily life do not apply in that psychic realm.
Yeah. And do you find that you naturally gravitate towards other psychic people? Like, do you have a lot of psychic friends?
It's funny. I feel most real. I know it sounds strange, but like most myself when I can be myself. And for many years and decades, I really didn't feel like I could talk about this with most people.
Yeah.
So it's great to have a space where you can just kind of be yourself. And now I'm kind of out there with all this, obviously.
Yeah.
But even studying over the years with different people, you connect with them and the other people who might be studying that group. So like, I think we've talked about this before. So I've been studying with Lynn Buchanan and this group of people for a few years now, and Lori Williams before. And they're well-known and very skilled remote viewers.
Mm-hmm.
I've taken some classes with Pam Coronado, who's a really well-known and incredibly skilled psychic detective, among other things. And you develop friendly relationships with them, and you meet other people, because it's like you don't have to do all of this explaining or justifying.
Right.
And there's a resonance.
Yeah.
I don't know if you find that too, but it's like any interest you have, there's a resonance with people who kind of get it without you having to even say anything.
Right. Whereas like the ordinary folks, the muggles, let's say, they don't quite get it. Yeah. Yeah, that's good. Cool. Well, anything else we should hit up here?
I'm trying to think. One thing that I mention in my course that I have, and also in the, I think in the audio program and the PDF, is that for me, people have varying opinions about this, but I think it's important to have good boundaries around your psychic work.
Hmm.
So just as you want to open up and tune in a structured way when you want to, I think it's just as important to also kind of close down. And that's why I include that in the imagery. It's like you wouldn't leave your front door open when you go to sleep.
Yeah.
I don't think. You want to just have good boundaries around everything you do, healthy ones, right? And so you want to be off duty sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And so the imagery can be used not only to open up, but to kind of appropriately close down. And I think people who are empaths or super spongy will
Yeah.
find that especially helpful.
Yeah. And that probably helps to conserve energy too, because I know that this work can be draining.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. I
Cool.
guess the other thing I would just say is, honestly, everyone's intuitive. You know,
Yeah.
it's kind of like playing piano. Everybody's not going to be Chopin. Most of us won't. You know, I'm a regular person who just happens to love this and do this. And this is part of my lived experience and it's a passion, but I don't do professional psychic readings.
Mm.
And people don't have to go into this with that aim.
Yeah.
It's really about just having it be another sense that they pay attention to and use to enhance their daily lives.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, no, I mean, it seems like a very powerful tool. But that's great. Do you have any upcoming events or things that we should know about?
you know, not at this time. I've decided to work on an audio program about managing grief, and I would like it to have a transpersonal element as well, so
Mhm.
that for people who want to learn how to connect either with the energy or the memory of a loved one, that they can do that.
Yeah.
Um, but I think that's pretty much what's in the can, or not in the can. That's not the right phrase.
Yeah.
In the works.
In the works. Yeah. All right. Well, that might be the next thing we can talk about. But
Yeah,
Traci,
that'd
thanks
be
so much
great.
for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be doing this.
Likewise. Thanks for doing it with us. And thank you, folks, for listening. If you have questions or a comment, please drop it below. Depending on what platform you're on, we'll try to respond. And we'll talk to you next time. Thanks again.